Hey, sunshine. Are you having trouble sleeping? I could help if you want. Okay. Where do you want me? Well, I could let you rest on my shoulder. Or you could lay down on my lap so that I can read and give you a head massage at the same time. Which one do you want? Okay, come here. Okay. So, I'm going to help you fall asleep by reading to you for an hour. Okay? And I'm going to read the series Infinite Dolores by Garnet and Opal. It's a 28-part series, but I'm going to read for an hour, so we'll see how many chapters we get through, okay? So, I want you to relax. Take a deep breath. Hold it. Release it. Good. Do it again. Good. I want you to relax your scalp. Relax your forehead. Relax your jaw. Yeah. Open your mouth. Move your jaw from side to side. Relax it. If you have to leave it open a little bit, you can. I want you to relax your neck and shoulders. Bring them down from your ears. Good job. You can feel your body getting heavier. Good job. Listen to the rain. Relax. Okay. Let's begin. Infinite Dolores. The Strange Case of Dolores Cranon. Chapter 1. Dolores. Dolores Cranon came into Blessed Mother complaining of severe stomach aches. After testing, it was found that she had an enormous tumor in her abdomen, so large that it was pushing on her diaphragm and making it difficult for her to breathe. What she had thought was middle-aged spread, and weight gain on top of it was a tumor. She lay on the gurney in the emergency room feeling stupid. More tests were needed, so they kept her overnight. Just before she was about to be released, one of the team of doctors asked for another scan. The tumor had grown in those 10 hours between the first scan and this second one. Its growth was not incremental. The tumor was a third larger, and the pressure on her internal organs was excruciating. She was given pain medication, and in less than an hour was being rushed into an operating room. The oncology surgeon made sure to tie off all the blood vessels leading to the tumor. The circulatory vessels were numerous. He then removed the tumor from Dolores Crannon's belly and weighed it. It weighed 45.2 pounds. He went back to his patient to start suturing her back together. The surgery had been long, but there were no complications. One of the nurses picked the tumor up by lifting the bloody plastic upon which it lay. She intended to discard it as medical waste, until it wailed. Half of the team rushed to the tumor, while the other half worked feverishly to close Dolores up. The tumor had no external features except an irregular wrinkle across one end. As they watched, the wrinkle opened up into a primitive mouth, and it wailed again. The Strange Case of Dolores Crannon, Chapter 2, The Tumor. Scans showed primitive lungs and a heart. The tumor did not appear to have any sensory system nor digestive system. A nurse and the anesthesiologist refused to have anything to do with testing the tumor or handling it. Whatever it is, it's not human, and I'm washing my hands of it, the anesthesiologist said. It's an aberrant bit of medical waste, that's all. One of the nurses asked, "What do we do with it? How do we feed it?" "It has a mouth, but no throat, no stomach, no rectum. It can't do anything with food, but it needs something to live." Hospital administration came back with a temporary solution: intravenous feeding. Another nurse spoke up. "How are we going to do that?" More scans were taken, and doctors were stunned to find blood vessels running all through the tumor. "How did we miss them?" one of them asked. They compared the newer scans with the previous ones. The blood vessels were new. Only one nurse had the guts to put in an IV line, during which time the tumor never stopped wailing. 10 minutes after the line was in, the nurse was sent home. She couldn't stop shaking and throwing up. The tumor grew, getting larger every hour, getting larger with every bag of nutrition hooked up to the IV line. It never gained any more systems or complex organs, no liver, no kidneys, no bones, no nerves or brain. It never gained any facial features, muscles, or limbs. Researchers found a rudimentary larynx just inside the mouth, which helped to explain the wailing. They had missed the larynx earlier because the scans of its lungs stopped short of the mouth, short enough to miss the small larynx. At 82 pounds, the tumor stopped growing. At times, its mass would jiggle. When it wasn't wailing, there was a constant, quiet mewling. The mouth had formed the tendency to remain in an open position. Other than wiggling and making sound, the tumor was inert. The temperature of its nearly skin-like surface slightly warmer than room temperature. Only a handful of nurses were willing to tend it. Most objected due to religious reasons, even though the Monsignor assured the staff that the tumor was human and had a soul. Christ encourages us to take care of our lesser brothers and sisters. "What is this poor suffering soul, if not one of our lessers?" he said. A few heads nodded, but only those 4 nurses remained willing to care for the tumor. As days and weeks went by, that small group of nurses became more and more isolated from the rest of the nursing staff, as if their care of the tumor made them somehow unclean or contagious. Genetic tests were performed. Not only did the tumor possess 46 chromosomes lined up nearly in 23 pairs, they were all X chromosomes. Technically, the tumor was female. Not surprisingly, its DNA was a 98% match to Dolores Cranon. The tumor carried the same genetic markers for mother and father, the same predisposition to heart disease and diabetes, which the tumor could never develop since it didn't have a pancreas. Perhaps that 98% match to Dolores was a bit surprising to the team. The remaining 2% didn't match anything on Earth. One day, a nurse noticed something as she was hooking up another bag of TPN nutrition. The tumor's normal pinkish color was muted, and there was a bulge on one side at the opposite end from the mouth. She noticed it on the chart, which was listed as Cranon X. Hours later, the nurse who relieved her noted that the bulge was considerably larger. Despite the late hour, the team of researchers met at the hospital only to find that the mass on the tumor was nearly a quarter of the size of the tumor itself. Scans of the tumor revealed that a mass was growing inside it. The tumor had a tumor. The Strange Case of Dolores Cranon, Chapter 3. The Second Tumor. Dolores Cranon's tumor had taken on a sickly gray color, its lower contour bulging out until the outer layer was shiny and slick to the touch. 2 days after the discovery of the tumor within the tumor, the research team became once again a surgery team. There was no anesthesia, just a quick, shallow incision. Ichor followed, and the second tumor wriggled its way out of the first. The team stood there, uncertain what to do. The second tumor had limbs. It looked like an enormous flesh-colored gingerbread man, its arms and legs ending in rounded nubs. Its head, a round blob with 3 slits as facial features. It was much smaller than the original tumor, only 36 pounds. Its limbs thrashed while the 2 smaller slits in its face flared open. The longer slit gaped wide, and the tumor began to squall, bashing the sheet beneath it as it flailed. The team stood looking at it until a nurse said, "There is no explaining any of this, but I know a baby when I see one." She swaddled the tumor in another sheet and held it while another nurse looked for a nursery table large enough to fit it. In short order, the second tumor was washed up, diapered, swaddled again, and set under a light in a bin on a table. Left alone on the surgical table, the first tumor died. When members of the team returned to it, they found it inert. It was only when one of them touched the tumor to start stitching the incision closed that she was startled by the temperature. The tumor was stone cold and much more solid to the touch. They all poked it with their gloved fingers. The oncologist spoke first. "We need to contact administration. In the meantime, this needs to be taken to the morgue." Administration contacted Dolores Cranon, who had known nothing of the tumor's development. She gagged and wept through the phone call. In the end, it was her decision to hold a funeral for the tumor. When asked what name to be used for the funeral and gravestone, Dolores couldn't decide. She asked what the hospital had called the tumor. When told its name was X. Cranon, she cried again. Christine. Her name is Christine, she said finally. She cried one more time when the administrator told her that the hospital was paying all funeral expenses. Monsignor Latour would be the celebrant at funeral mass. It was a cold, bright, windy morning. The only people present at Christine Cranon's funeral were Dolores, the Monsignor, and the members of Christine's team. The only one who cried was Dolores. She was now convinced that she had lost a baby, a severely deformed baby. The Monsignor spoke of the Lord's ever-present mercy, easing the suffering of the innocent. After the service, one of the nurses hugged Dolores, who was still overcome by the situation. Christine's baby is doing fine, she told Dolores in a comforting voice. Dolores hit the ground in a dead faint. The nurse who told Dolores of the tumor's tumor was let go that afternoon, reducing the nurses on the team to 3. The team was advised by administration to tell no one of the second tumor and to go to administration if any questions were raised. Scans and x-rays showed the team that the second tumor had bones, a digestive system, a heart, and kidneys. Primitive muscle formations gave the tumor gross motor movement. Its DNA was a 99% match to the first tumors, and a 97% match to Dolores. Members of the team split into 2 groups. One group continued to refer to it as a tumor. The other group called it she, her, and infant. They were all, however, agreed on one thing. There was no explanation of how either the first or second tumor originated. The oncologist said in solemn tones, "This is new ground for all of us." A nurse brought some small t-shirts from home to dress the second tumor, and the name on the chart was Cranon X2. The Strange Case of Dolores Cranon. Chapter 4. X2. The second tumor grew less quickly than the first, and it developed more specialized cells. There was soft skin on its outer surface, mucosa lining the slits in its face and rectum, sweat glands in its armpits and on its forehead, a fine layer of hair on the very top of its head. Scans showed a small button-like knob at the top of the spinal column, and the rest of the skull was like a large sinus with thin baffles of bone channeling the air. Its esophagus led to a rudimentary stomach. Its trachea split before reaching the lungs. Dolores Cranon visited the tumor every other week or so. The team watched her carefully, suspecting a psychotic break. However, Dolores offered the tumor no violence and kept her bi-weekly visits well under 10 minutes. The team put in surveillance cams and mics. Hospital administrators hired more people to be on the team. The 2 newest hires were there to monitor recordings. Administration was alerted when the tumor started to coo. Sensory tests were done, suspecting that the tumor was reacting to touch since it was blind and deaf. It did not respond to pricking, tickling, heat, cold, or light impact. It was fed intravenously, but one of the nurses brought in baby food after clearing it with the oncologist, who was the lead on the tumor team. And the tumor would smack its mouth slit, but did not coo. It cooed only when Dolores visited it, but she didn't seem to notice that. Her visits were short, as if obligatory. In many respects, the second tumor was like a very large infant of a very young age. It did not have any control over its bladder or rectum. It flailed its appendages almost at random. Like an infant, it responded to cuddling or skin-to-skin contact. 2 of the 3 nurses were willing to test this. As long as it was cuddled, the tumor cooed, not unlike a pigeon. There was a brief wail when it was put back in its bin. During Dolores's next visit, several members of the team followed. As soon as Dolores stepped through the door, the tumor cooed. "What's her name?" asked a nurse. "Josie." "I'm going to put that on her chart right now," the nurse said. "I don't like calling her X." After regarding the tumor for a few moments, listening to it coo, Dolores asked, "Can I hold her?" The team had Dolores sit in a chair because the tumor was approaching 40 pounds. They brought a regular flannel blanket folded in half and swaddled the tumor. As Dolores sat and rocked her upper body, holding on to the tumor hugged her back and cooed. After that visit, Dolores's visits became daily. The Strange Case of Dolores Grannon, Chapter 5. The Next Formation. Dolores's voice cried out over the intercom. "There's something wrong with Josie." Her voice got shriller and more panicked. "Do something." A nurse on the team responded, rushing into the room to see the tumor lying in its bin, its diaper off, and Dolores pointing at the side of, for lack of a better term, the tumor's belly. Off to one side, there was a pinkish bump about the size of a small grape. Using a touch thermometer, the nurse measured the warmth of the area. The reading over the bump was no higher or lower than readings taken all over the tumor. "What is it?" Dolores wanted to know. "I can't really say. I have to call the doctor." The oncologist cut short a staff meeting to examine the tumor. He ordered scans and blood tests. He told Dolores that it was too soon to tell what was going on. Later, he told the team, "I think we're catching this one early. We're going to take scans every 8 hours. I think we're going to see how these tumors are forming." The first scans showed a small growth about 4 millimeters across, less than the diameter of a pencil. It was unclear if the growth was attached to an organ or to the inner wall of the abdomen. There were already numerous blood vessels snaking through the area, feeding the growth. The tumor vocalized and moved as it normally did. Pressure on the small growth elicited no response. One of the nurses said, "We're going to have to start calling them by name. Tumor and growth don't really describe what is going on." The team didn't like any of the recommendations any of them came up with. X2 and X3 were too easily switched. Mother and embryo were too emotional, and embryo would probably have to change to fetus at some point, and then to infant. Patient and tumor were better. Except that the original tumor wasn't a patient, and therefore the second tumor wasn't a patient, and all of them were tumors to begin with. Dolores called the second one Josie, offered one voice. It was an odd way to refer to a patient. A subject of research and study, but it was acceptable. "What about Eve?" asked another. Response on this suggestion was divided. Too religious, too biblical. No. Just no. Finally, someone suggested, "What about naming them like hurricanes or storms? Since this one is Josie, the next would start with K, like Caitlin." No one knew what the future would bring, so an alphabetic system would at least allow room for growths, as one of the more comedic members of the team expressed it. Dolores left the hospital only after she was gently told to come back tomorrow. "We'll have more information then," the nursing assistant said. The next day, no one had more information for Dolores. The Strange Case of Dolores Cranon. Chapter 6. Caitlin. During each daily visit, Dolores checked the bulge on Josie's side. It seemed to her that the growth was only getting larger, and no one would tell her what it was. She laid her hand against it. Already, the bulge was nearly as long as her pinky finger. The next day, it was a tiny bit longer. Not very much at all, except that it was that tiny bit bigger. Maybe 1/16 of an inch. The following day, she brought in her dressmaker's measuring tape in her purse. She typed 2¼ inches by 1�3/8 inches in a note on her cell phone. The oncologist was adamant that no one on the team talked to Dolores except himself. "I want to make sure that we are giving her one version of the truth, and only one version. That means that we have to limit the information. Remember, Dolores is not just the original patient, she is my patient. I don't want her to suffer mentally or emotionally due to things that are causing professionals no small amount of concern. So, if she approaches you, politely let her know I will speak with her." Another member of the team, one of the most recent admissions, had left, citing time conflicts with his classes. Alternate hours were suggested to him, but he declined, never actually stating the obvious. He wanted no more to do with this. Stress was starting to show on all members of the team. Stress from long hours, stress from caring for a body that could not assist in its own care, stress from the need for discretion, stress from personal beliefs, stress from colleagues and rumors, stress from being around something that made no sense constantly, stress from just being around something so alien. Every member of the team understood what the oncologist meant. If they, who were trained and had so much experience, were stressed almost to breaking, what would an untrained person do? Later, one of the nurses remarked, "We're going off the deep end, and no one knows where the bottom is, or if there even is a bottom." After nearly 2 weeks of slow increase in size, the growth known as Caitlin suddenly picked up its rate of growth. Scans already showed Caitlin's stomach and heart, as well as limbs and a mass in the skull. Under his breath, the oncologist said, "Eerie, it almost looks like an embryo." To him, it looked like that short span of development when an embryo becomes a fetus. He brought a maternal fetal specialist into the team. At first, the specialist disregarded the team's input, especially the more emotional, intuitive input. But after reviewing the entire medical record, starting with Dolores Cranon's records, she let the team know she was willing to listen. From that point on, the maternal fetus specialist put in more hours than the other members of the team. She ordered ultrasounds done every 6 hours, and more team members were hired to assist her, all medical professionals with obstetric and perinatal experience. "We are going to proceed as if this were any ectopic pregnancy going to term," she told them. The oncologist again cautioned that discretion was paramount. All discussion of Josie or Caitlin was to be kept within the team. Not only was he the go-to for communicating to Dolores, he was also the only one to liaise with administration. Caitlin's growth spurt continued and increased. The team estimated her weight at 5 pounds. In 24 hours, she gained another pound. In another 24 hours, she gained 1 pound, 4 ounces. Dolores was not allowed to visit. Because Caitlin's size was causing stretch marks on Josie's skin, and Dolores got emotionally upset over each new perceived, covertly measured difference in Josie's appearance, to the point she became combative when told to leave the room. Although no one on the team mentioned it, they noticed that Josie stopped cooing when Dolores raised her voice. None of them wanted to admit that they each suspected Josie had some awareness of what was going on around her. "I have a right to see my baby," she exclaimed. The oncologist was called, and he met with Dolores in the chapel. Dolores continued to come to the hospital daily, and he met her in the chapel every time. He invited the Monsignor to meet with them. Although he wouldn't divulge his feelings to Dolores or any of the team, the Monsignor had a very strong feeling that Caitlin's origin was not unlike Christ's, immaculate. Likewise for Josie and Christine, rather than demonic, their origin seemed divine to him. God is unfathomable, he thought. It seemed to him that each child, for he could not regard them as tumors, was a step closer to a perfect vessel. But he had so many questions. Would the last one bear an angel's essence? Would she be God's word made flesh again? And that is what was meant by the promise of the second coming. At the thought of that possibility, the Monsignor found himself shaking his head. No one considered that the second time Christ comes, Christ might choose the form of a woman. Or, if someone had considered that, he had not read or heard of it. The Monsignor asked to be a member of the team and was permitted to join them. Although he didn't need an introduction, the oncologist officially introduced him to the team. And from then on, the Monsignor attended most team meetings and viewed much of the research. He also met with Dolores, and they prayed together. The Strange Case of Dolores Cranon. Chapter 7. Meeting Caitlin. Josie had stopped growing at 47 pounds, and now the bulge on her side went from the middle of her leg to her armpit. Their combined weight was 77 pounds. The skin over the bulge was darkening. It was nearly purple now, and the obstetric staff on the team were on call 24 hours. No one had any way of predicting when Caitlin should be removed from Josie. Dolores was getting more and more insistent about visiting Josie. She caused a scene several times. The first time it happened, the oncologist called security after warning her that he would do that. Upon seeing 3 security officers approach her, Dolores stopped shouting and pointing, trying to push past staff. Instead, she sobbed and then left under her own power. After that, the mention of security was enough to calm her tantrums. At wit's end, she turned to the Monsignor and begged for his intercession. True to his word, the Monsignor approached the oncologist and made a good argument for letting Dolores know what was happening with Josie. Neither Blessed Mother nor her parent corporation, Sisters of Goodwill, want the exposure of a mother telling the media that she is not allowed to see her child, especially when it is this child. Do you want to explain to the media how Josie came to be? Or Caitlin? Or why they haven't heard of this until now? The oncologist countered. How are we going to explain Caitlin to Dolores? It was already a stretch for her to accept Josie, who was the growth on her first tumor. Christine, the Monsignor said. Yes, I remember Christine, as does Dolores. I think she can grow to accept Caitlin if it is all explained to her. She is genuinely concerned about Josie. She thinks she will be able to take Josie home at some point, so we need to let her know everything. She needs to understand that Josie can never go home with her. Otherwise, we will see her on the evening news and all over the internet. The oncologist made an appointment for Dolores to come and talk with him and the Monsignor. At the last minute, he asked a few members of the team to attend, so that they could give input on the care they were giving Josie and Caitlin. The maternal and fetal specialists asked to be included, so it was a large group of people that Dolores met. Uncount, she asked to see Josie that day. The meeting took all morning, with some team members popping out and back in. They had so much to tell Dolores, and some of it needed repetition because it seemed like she wasn't putting all the information together. When she finally grasped everything they said, she sat back and stared at the team. So, you don't know if Josie is a tumor or a person? Not really, do you? And you don't know how all of this started, do you? And it looks like Josie is going to have either a tumor or a person, a baby. And we didn't talk about her much, but you still don't know if Christine was a tumor or a person. We're in the middle of a mystery. The oncologist replied, You're right. Everything you said is right. Why me? She asked. Why now? No one had the answer to either of those questions, but they didn't have long to think about it, because they were called to rush to Josie's room. One of the nurses was out in the hall, waving at them to hurry. Since no one stopped her, Dolores rushed right along with them. The first team member to reach Josie's side witnessed it all. A puckered line appeared along Josie's side, starting high in her left armpit and running down to where she should have had a knee. The line reddened and became puffy, swelling very quickly. Josie's limbs flailed, thudding loudly against her bedclothes and bin, and her usual mewling sound became shrill, more like a scream. In the middle of the puffed area, a dark red line appeared. The dark red line split open. Josie stopped flailing, and the mewling sound was almost breathy. Dolores was sobbing quietly. Caitlin crawled out of Josie's body, her fingers grabbing the blankets, her feet kicking to get free. The Strange Case of Dolores Cranon. Chapter 8. The Sisters. At what the team referred to as her delivery, Caitlin weighed 24 pounds. She had fingers and toes, a face, joints in her arms and legs. Apart from her size, she looked as close to a human baby as a doll might. Every feature present was not quite defined or developed enough. She had outer ears, but no external meatus or earlobes. She had nostrils, but they were separate tubes not joined on each side of a nasal lobule. She had lips, but the skin on them was as thick as the surrounding skin. No vermilion border, no vermilion zone. The skin on her lips was featureless, therefore no lip prints. On each hand, she had 4 fingers with one joint in the middle, but no fingernails or prints. The thumb on each hand was fixed, jointless. It was the same for her toes. The 4 smaller toes had one joint, no nail or prints, and the large toe was fixed and lacked joints. She had light brown hair on the top of her head, but no eyebrows or eyelashes. Her eyelids were smooth with an epicanthic fold, and the eyes themselves were small and did not track. Instead, they stayed in a fixed position. She had small buttocks, but the front of her pelvic area was completely featureless. Like a doll, she had most of the basic features of a human, but details were missing or twisted. The maternal fetal specialist said in an aside comment to one of her team, "Caitlin is 100 different birth defects rolled into one person. Every time I think we have fully described her condition, I realize there is one more detail to add that never combines with the other features." Unlike a usual human body or baby doll, Caitlin had teeth, 6 of them, 2 up, 4 down. Behind them was a smooth palate over the oral cavity and a small pointed tongue on the floor of the cavity. Also, unlike a baby, Caitlin could form syllables, primarily stop consonants like B, D, or G, and the sonorant M, followed by the low back vowel A. The first speech therapist invited to the team declined, but her junior colleague joined and enthusiastically started to catalog Caitlin's speech abilities and devise a plan of treatment. Even more so than Christine or Josie before her, Caitlin was scanned and photographed from every aspect over her entire body and head, inside and outside. Testing showed she was a 99% genetic match to Josie and 95% match to Dolores, which stunned the team. Administration brought in more specialists to the team, geneticists, early development, pediatric dentists. Caitlin became the best-kept secret at Blessed Mother, occupying a room in a wing that limited access to only team members and select administration staff. At first, Josie was kept in the same room with Caitlin, but administration made the decision to give them separate rooms. Dolores was now granted permission to visit each of them, but her emotions were raw and volatile. When holding Josie, Dolores cried, sometimes sobbing deeply, at which point Caitlin would show signs of distress. Josie's heart rate was getting increasingly slower, her temperature cooler, her movements weak and voice reedy. Her usual color muted to a grayish pink. It didn't take a professional to see that Josie was dying. Dolores split her visits between Josie and Caitlin, often bringing toys, flowers, or clothing. Caitlin received toddler-sized clothing, and Josie received t-shirts that covered her to the middle of her legs. Dolores often referred to them as each other's sister. Staff looked on during these visits. One of them said, "I don't want to be here when Josie dies." Another replied, "None of us do." They had all seen patients die, siblings and children die, but there was something so different about the Cranon deaths. Perhaps it was that there were so many unknowns and unforeseeables. Perhaps it was the closeness of the team itself. Perhaps it was that while one of them thrived so rapidly, the other declined just as rapidly. Administration looked on as well. The number of surveillance cams were doubled. One of the concerns discussed was how much they were willing to spend on another funeral. Josie's. Another was how to continue keeping the media out. Yet another was how much more they would spend on any subsequent tumors, growths, odd births, since the team was expanding and the diagnostic tests increasing. So far, Blessed Mother had kept knowledge of the 3 tumors from the Sisters of Goodwill, and there was growing disquiet that withholding that information could turn into career wreckers for the people involved. As expected, the chief financial officer was interested in the expenses, while the CEO was concerned about optics. But both agreed on this. Blessed Mother was running out of time. The Strange Case of Dolores Cranon, Chapter 9. Mother and Child. Holding Josie after she passed, Dolores keened, her heart shattered. An orderly gently convinced Dolores to let go of her so that she could be cared for. He reminded Dolores that her other child needed her and led her crying to Caitlin's room. "Dwar," Caitlin said. It was the closest she could get to pronouncing Dolores's name. She was, at this point, 6 days old. As Dolores held Caitlin and rocked, Caitlin made a small sound. Still crying, Dolores kissed her head. "I love you. I love you." Dolores wiped tears from Caitlin's cheeks. They held onto each other without saying anything more. Many of the team doubted that Caitlin was actually speaking, thinking that she was simply parroting sound. The speech therapist strongly disagreed. She never says "Dwar" to anyone but Dolores. She's obviously made the connection between the sounds she hears, the sounds she makes, the person's name, and the person. How much more do you need? Privately, one of the assistants said, "My cockatiel says hello, but I don't think he's actually talking to me. Greeting me." The nurse he was speaking to replied, "I wouldn't be surprised if Caitlin started reading today. You can't compare her to a bird. You can't compare her to a baby, either. She's growing, but not like a baby. And whether or not she understands language, she is making sounds babies don't make. She has a toddler's language, a young child's shape. Her head is too small in proportion to her body for a baby, and she is way too alert. She's some weird mix-up of toddler, child, and adolescent." If Dolores overheard any of the comments made, she never let them know. Instead, she concentrated on caring for Caitlin, brushing her hair and putting bows in it, dressing her. In a way, many were impressed by her ability to accept Caitlin's oddities, but any who knew a parent with a special needs child found Dolores to be very similar. Dolores was rolling with all the special quirks, accepting them and loving Caitlin. The maternal fetal specialist said to the oncologist, "It's going to be tough when she finds out that Caitlin isn't going home with her. But Caitlin can't go home with her." The oncologist shook his head. "No. It's not just a simple thing of learning to care for Caitlin. No one can say for certain whether or not the tumor process has stopped. What happens if Caitlin develops growth like herself? What if that starts to happen in a way that hasn't presented before and Dolores doesn't recognize it for what it is? What if Caitlin gets ill or injured, and Dolores takes her for urgent or emergent care? How will they be able to help Caitlin when they don't know anything about her? I don't know Dolores' insurance situation, but if she does have insurance, how will she get Caitlin on it? She can't even prove Caitlin exists because there isn't a birth certificate. Caitlin wasn't born. Will Caitlin go to school? And when would she start? Who could assess her to place her in a class? Issues increase exponentially the moment Caitlin goes out any door of this hospital." "And the media," the specialist said, in a near whisper. She thought of the circus it would create if word of Caitlin slipped out. Yes. And admin. We can't forget admin. We can't list all the issues Caitlin will face because we don't know enough about her processes. But we will be brought to task if anything goes wrong. Together, the doctors looked at mother and child.